Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. As always, we have a great webinar on tap, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will be able to access it later on. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience, so if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for our speaker, please don't wait, don't hesitate, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions, and we'll get to as many questions as we can before the end of today's webinar. Okay, with that, we'll kick off today's webinar, which is Gary Gruver, Transform Planning in Your Digital Transformation. Our speakers today are Gary Gruver, who is president of Gruver Consulting, and he's being joined by Jeff Keyes, who is director of product marketing at Plutora. Hi guys, how you doing? Thanks for joining me.
Great.
Awesome. This is
good.
good.
All right, well, Jeff, I know you're going to kick things off, so I'm turning it over to you and put myself on mute.
Fantastic. I love these topics because it is, we just got back from Enterprise Summit in Vegas and another conference after that. And so many people struggle with this topic that we're going to hear about in transforming how software is built and planned and designed, and how do you take these monolithic applications, and every step I find myself going back to this book, Gary, that you wrote with Engineering the Digital Transformation, and the principles that are in it are just profound, and it shows. So you're in for a treat to talk through how planning is the next step after you get through the first pieces. So with that, and from that, Gary, you're an advisor to us here at Plutora, and the reason why we like this topic is simply because if you follow this method by Gary, you're going to need a tool like Plutora to help you in your journey. So with that, Gary, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. Do you believe how your company develops and delivers software is critical to how it competes? Do you believe your organization can be more efficient and more effective in terms of how it develops and delivers software? But do you struggle to get everyone in your organization aligned on making improvements? And then when you make those improvements, do you struggle to be able to show the value of that change so that you can convince people to invest even more in continuous improvement? If you answered yes to these questions, you're similar to most of my clients. What if instead you had a systematic approach that you could engage everybody in the organization on a continuous improvement journey for optimizing your software and development and delivery processes? Can you see how that'd make a huge difference? The goal of this book and this webinar series is to provide that systematic approach that you can engage everybody in the journey of continuous improvement. And a lot of what we're trying to do here is improve the flow of value to our customers, to our clients, to our business. One of the first ways that was looked at this in manufacturing, has done a really good job, is Goldratt, and he focused on theory of constraints. And what he determined is that there's really a bottleneck in terms of how you deliver value through a manufacturing facility. And in the past, they would try to keep everyone busy and try to keep everybody working as hard as they could, but he realized is if you don't focus on the bottleneck of the process, then you really aren't going to get any improvements. And so he came up with his 5 focusing theories where you'd find the constraints and you'd find the slowest part of the manufacturing process, and then you'd focus in on improving that, because if you made improvements outside of that constraint, it really wasn't improving the flow over the overall system. And as we think about software development, and we think about how to get more productive, we need to focus on what's slowing us down, where is it in the process. And as Goldratt talks, he really starts with these 5 focusing steps. You want to know where the constraint is, you want to decide how to exploit the system constraint, and you want to focus everything on making that more effective. You want to elevate it, and if we move this constraint, then we go back to step 1 and we understand where it is. So it's a systematic process of continually understanding what's slowing us down the most, prioritizing fixing it, going after it, and going on the next thing. And for software, we really need to think about where the bottleneck is. Is it in planning or requirements? Is it in development? Is it in the deployment pipeline? Is it in triage and defect fixing? And is it in release to production? And in a lot of cases, it can be in all of those places, and it can move around over time depending on how you're doing on your continuous improvement journey. Most organizations really start with it being, whoops, sorry, I had two computers going and I wasn't keeping up. So here were the 5 focusing steps. And if you missed it on the slide, send an email. I have a list at the end where you can get it to there. And when you look at understanding the bottleneck, you really need to understand where it is. And for most organizations that start on this journey, it's really in these repetitive tasks. It's in the deployment pipeline of create an environment, build the code, deploy the code, and test the code. And the nice thing about software is, unlike theory of constraints with manufacturing, when you go and you look at these things, each piece of the process can only process one part or one set of parts per cycle time. And in software, what we've got is, when we look at these processes of create an environment, build the code, deploy the code, and test the code, we don't have a natural constraint in there, because we can do this for 1 line of code change and 100 lines of code change for the same amount of time and energy. But what we can do is, as we start to automate these repetitive tasks, we can have them happen very frequently and very often, and we can improve the quality of it. So while it's not a natural bottleneck, for most organizations that are manual in these steps, some of the DevOps steps, what you will find is this really is what's slowing them down as an organization. And when we're looking at these different organizations, what we talked about in one of the first webinars was, we really need to understand the type of problem we're trying to solve. It's going to be different for different solutions. It's going to be different for different applications. If you've got a loosely coupled system, like we talk a lot about in DevOps, where you have a small team that can independently develop, qualify, and deploy code, you're going to solve these problems one way, and you're going to have bottlenecks to the flow in certain places. If you've got a large, tightly coupled system like this, as we discussed in that webinar, you're going to have different types of challenges, and you're going to end up needing to make your software development processes, deployment processes visible. Or if you have an embedded system, you're going to need to make that visible. The first step, as we discussed early on, is to understand where the bottlenecks of the flow are. We need to have a good visibility of our process. We need to make that visible so people can align on the types of things that we need to go after. Once we have that visible, one of the biggest breakthroughs that we discuss next in transforming how you do software development is really building in quality and fundamentally changing that. We discussed one of the biggest challenges is that people start trying to build in quality or change their approaches to that before they have a stable quality signal. We walked through some different steps that you do to evaluate and determine whether you have a stable quality signal. And a lot of what we're trying to do with that is we can't automate all these repetitive tasks at once. And we want to start with the ones that are causing the most issues in your organization. So we had our Pareto chart of the types of issues were being found, and we have the steps to creating a stable quality signal that we really use to understand what are these issues. And it's really focused on prioritizing the different types of improvement that you can make with these repetitive tasks that can be automated. And the steps, we had different steps and we had different data, but it's really, you're trying to prioritize, should you focus on your test automation design and the ability of your test data? Do you need to get down and understand the root cause of instability? And do you need to automate your deployment, or do you need to create your environments? And realistically, you need to do all of these eventually, but different deployment pipelines, different part of your organizations are going to have different challenges. And you need a process for identifying which ones are causing the biggest issues if you're going to get to the source of your biggest bottlenecks and the things that you need to be fixing. After that, we covered briefly the idea of really moving into optimizing workflow. And what happens is once you automate, I'm sorry, I'm not doing a very good job of working on both computers at the same time, so I'm going to switch. Once you've started optimizing workflow, what tends to happen for most organizations is that you move to defect fixing and triage being your biggest issue. And now that you've automated your repetitive task, what you can do is move to smaller and smaller batch sizes that enables that triage and defect fixing to be more efficient. And as we do that, we're starting to move towards building in quality where we try to gate code. And what's different about software is you don't have to stop the line because it's not the process creating the defect. What you want to do is gate bad code for moving it further down the deployment pipeline and into the system, and we use this as the process for doing that. And because we gate the code, we're catching it closer to the developer so they can react and respond to it real time. And that's the process that we use for building in quality and getting that into the system. Then we also monitor with our product control charts that we talked about, really the types of things that are getting past our quality gate and improving that over time. And what we really get to is eventually a larger complex system where we're providing quality gates across the system. And we have these charts that enable you to tell from build to build what broke. So we're making the triage process very efficient for things that got past the quality gates. And we can also, when we look at this, we can look across environments and figure out when things broke. So this enables efficient triage and debug of both environment issues and of code issues when we look at our environment control charts. And then we use our quality gates to keep things from moving down the line and getting further in the system. All of these things are really focused on once we've got the deployment pipeline automated and running efficiently with a stable quality signal. Next, we're moving on into triage and defect fixing is a typical bottleneck that most organizations move through. Once we've worked through these steps, we've got a set of metrics that we talked about. We put together more details available in that webinar where we really showed the types of waste and inefficiency that are slowing down flow. And you can work to prioritize those, fix those things once and for all to where you can optimize it. And essentially, you're trying to move the bottleneck from the deployment pipeline to the triage and defect fixing. And in some cases, it may move to the release. If you don't own the release process, you're an embedded product or you're selling customized off-the-shelf software that people deploy on their own sites. But eventually, as we solve those problems, what we're really trying to do is get it down to where the bottleneck is either in the planning and requirements process or in the development process. And some people would argue that the bottleneck should really be in the ideation area. I guess my argument would be I've lived in large software organizations, and if the bottleneck ends up being in the ideation process, you're probably going to end up right sizing and downsizing. From my perspective, we really want to be thinking about moving it on to development and having that be the bottleneck, and then trying to do everything that we can think of to make them more productive in the system and make them more effective. But for this webinar, we're going to focus a little bit more in getting into the planning process and really understanding that interaction between developers and the other side of it. And when you look at planning and manufacturing, there's really two different types of planning that we do. One is planning for product development, where we want to know when something's going to be done and what we're going to complete. And the other is planning for production. And this is how do we release work into the manufacturing process? How do we manage that efficiently? How do we make sure we're not building up too much inventory? And across the board, everywhere we've looked at, people tend to think of planning like this. We're trying to understand what we're going to deliver, when we're going to deliver it. We're trying to work and coordinate different pieces and parts and when they come together. And this is really important for physical products because you need to understand when you're going to integrate, when you're going to put things together. In manufacturing development, they talk about phase gate R&D, where you go through different phases, you make sure all the pieces are coming together and work. And this is really important for manufacturing because you're trying to coordinate a lot of different pieces and parts and different parts of either the manufacturing or the product design and make sure everything's coming together, because you're trying to create, even when you get to a point where you're going to create a prototype, you're trying to coordinate a lot of different work, a lot of different moving parts. And if you don't have the ability to plan these things really well in detail, you're going to end up with going to a manufacturing ramp, you won't have a part, you won't have a piece. Instead of doing this detailed Gantt type chart where you're trying to plan all the details, what they learned at Toyota is that was much less important. When you're looking at coordinating all this work, they moved to a fundamental different approach with the Toyota product development system. And in this case, they would have a chief engineer, and that chief engineer was responsible for the vision for the product, the design objectives, but he was also responsible for the delivery of that. And instead of putting together Gantt charts that really detailed all those different pieces, what they did is they would have product integration milestones. And these product integration milestones would typically be, twice as frequent as a typical automobile manufacturer. And at these milestones, everybody was expected to deliver a working prototype. And the teams weren't as much measured on accuracy to plan because everybody knew it was unacceptable to miss that date. What the teams were measured on was the quality of their deliverables at that point in time. So whether you looked at the Toyota production system, which is a more modern approach, or the detail of the Gantt chart, what you're really trying to do is coordinate the work across a lot of individual physical pieces and parts to make sure everything's coming together and deliver on time. Because in physical products, you're trying to integrate and pull all these different pieces together. As we talked about earlier on developing a really structured approach to standing up the deployment pipeline, when you get an automated deployment pipeline like this, where you're building in quality and you're optimizing the flow through the system, you really don't need planning to provide that role of coordination, because the deployment pipeline is pulling together the code and integrating it frequently daily, maybe multiple times a day, in a way that you couldn't possibly ever do with planning. So in this case, that role that planning has traditionally played of pulling all the pieces together and making sure they work together is automated. It's happening very frequently. We've gotten to the point where we can go very quickly from something being developed to being ready to be in production quickly and efficiently because we've invested in the deployment pipeline. And for this, now planning really comes down to making sure that the development teams are working on the highest priority items, because we know they can efficiently get from one end of the system to the other very quickly. And this is the agile process of making sure you have a prioritized backlog. We need to be working on that on a regular basis. And this, for software, making sure that you have a very efficient deployment pipeline as productively as possible in taking something that starts development and then to the customer as quick as possible is one of the key steps that we need to make happen. And then the other is making sure that we're really working on a prioritized backlog. And that's the shift for the planning process that we can really need to take advantage of the unique characteristics and capabilities we've created in software. The other thing that we really need to look at is how do we release work into the system? And for manufacturing with Goldratt, what he did is once he understood where the bottleneck was, he'd call that the drum. That's the rate that you should release work into production. And you put a little buffer in front of the bottleneck so make sure that they're never starved for work. And then you don't release any other work into the system until you have a pull based on the rope from the bottleneck. So if the bottleneck quit producing parts, you should quit releasing work into production. And they did this because they realized if you kept introducing work into the production and it wasn't getting past the bottleneck, what you ended up doing is you created a whole bunch of work in progress, you created a lot of thrash, you had to spend a lot of time expediting and trying to figure out how to solve these different issues. So they moved to the drum buffer rope to figure out how to release work into the system. Toyota took this a step further in terms of not just focused on where the bottleneck was, but it was a Kanban system. And this is a process where you put a tray of parts between all the different manufacturing processes, and you don't create more product and until you have an empty bin to fill. And it was really a similar approach to how to control the release of work through the system based on making sure there wasn't too much inventory being built up. And they used the trays to minimize the amount of inventory that can be built. And so you essentially had a small buffer in front of each process, but you couldn't continue to build if there wasn't an empty tray available for you to put in it. And that's how they managed inventory in the system. For software, we have similar challenges. We need to think about our requirements inventory and our investment in that. You know, you can start with coming up with an idea for a new feature or new capability, and then eventually you're going to move it into something, maybe t-shirt sizing or Fibonacci numbers, to just figure out whether it makes sense so you can prioritize whether you should work on it or not. And then eventually you're going to break that requirement into a lot of detail to go down and work on it and go into that detail. And that's going to take a higher investment. And then you're going to put it under development. And this is where ideally we want the bottleneck to be. So in this scenario, this should really be our drum and our buffer and our rope. And then you can look at the release process. And in this case, what we're seeing is that we're releasing about 20 requirements per quarter, but we've got 60 requirements under development. In this case, what we've designed is we've developed we're releasing work into the system in a way that's creating way too much work in process. And what we're going to see is a lot of task switching and a lot of thrash here. And to make this process more efficient, what we need to do is look at the release process and the developers. And we don't want to pull any more work into development until it's been released out of the system. And we don't really need to do a whole lot more work breakdown and pull developers off of developing these features when I've already got more work under development. So in this situation where you're able to analyze and look at where you have requirements in the different phases, what you need to focus on is getting things done as opposed to starting more. And you're going to start over here with your release process being the bottleneck. And as you get that solved, you're going to really want it here on the development. And you don't want to do more t-shirt sizing. You don't want to do more work day until you've got more value flowing through in your requirements process. So we're trying to optimize the flow, optimize the bottleneck. And by doing that, we are trying to reduce the work in process. So just like for product development and manufacturing, we have one need, which is how do we coordinate the work? And we have another need for how do we release work into production? For software development, we have two things. We have one is how do we coordinate the work? And the deployment pipeline's automated and doing that on a much more frequent basis than we can do with planning. And the second start of this is how do we release work into production? Whether it's drum buffer rope or Kanban, what we need to think about is where's the bottleneck at the time in our process, and how do we not release work downstream until work has been completed so we're not building up excess inventory in the system. I know this is a little different. It's a different way of thinking about it. Everybody who thinks about planning thinks about it this way, but software is a different beast. And if we're going to get people to think about it differently and do it differently, we really need to help them understand what was done in manufacturing and why, and how software is different and how we can create a different approach. And because this is so fundamentally different, it's going to take people working with their leadership teams, with the business side, to help them understand the value of doing it differently, how it can be done differently. I usually start with an example of what we did at HP, where we fundamentally took a different approach to planning and how we did these things. And what we found before we made the transformation is that we were using about 20% of our capacity just to do planning. After we did the transformation, we went to only using 5% of our capacity for planning, and in the process, we released 15% of capacity that we could focus on delivering throughput for our customers and value for the customers. And that's the type of example that you're going to have to use in your organizations to convince people to change. And you're also going to need to help them understand how and why planning can and should be different for software to remove that next source of waste. Because as we've gone through the different pieces of this, we've really moved the bottleneck from the deployment pipeline to triage and defects fixing. We've solved our deployment. And if we're going to optimize it to this next level to take advantage of these capabilities we've created, we're going to have to take a different approach to planning and releasing work into the system than's traditionally been done for other parts of the system. Go real quick here. What we did at HP is we needed to make commitments over long range. So a lot of people say, well, Agile is about not making commitments. And I would say, no, Agile is about taking advantage of the flexibility that software can provide and just making the long range commitments that are required to support business decisions. At HP, when we started, it was taking 105% of our capacity just to release products. And when the business came to us and said, should we build a new manufacturing line for this next printer, it would require a lot of detailed planning, extensive amount of time. When we automated the deployment pipeline, the testing, when we got rid of branches, all of a sudden that long range commitment was taking less than 50% of our capacity. And when it was taking less than 50% of our capacity, it enabled us to very quickly let them know, yes, for that long range business decision, 18 months from now, we will be ready to release this product. I don't know what features it's going to have. I don't know what capabilities it will have, but I will run that product and it will have the latest capabilities of the code base at that time. That enabled us to make the long range commitments. Next, we got into a little medium range commitments where we were trying to understand what we could commit to in that range of time. And we used a very simple process where we had requirements engineers look at the amount of effort each of the different initiatives took. This wasn't a detailed work breakdown schedule. This was probably more like what you would consider a t-shirt sizing or Fibonacci numbers to give you a quick estimate of the amount of effort involved in making these new features and capabilities. And it really supported the business decisions that the marketing team was trying to make at that time. And we walked through this, and you could really quickly realize that initiatives A through G are probably going to happen. Don't worry about those. Don't worry about trying to prioritize C versus D, because it doesn't really matter. Both of them are going to happen. If you're thinking about initiatives L and M, start the grieving process. This isn't going to happen. It's not going to come together. If you're in here between H and K, it may or may not happen depending on how the development goes. Additionally, if we look down the path, we really probably as an organization should think about moving people off of different components and onto components like component 10 and component 3 that are really slowing down our ability to deliver the value. So for a lightweight planning process, we were quickly able to figure out 6 months out how much was needed and what wasn't. And then after that, pretty much everything that we did was focused in on the requirements and how much value we were getting through the organization. We'd have a backlog of the requirements that were in queue. We had an idea how much was getting done each month. And instead of planning these in detail, we stayed heads down just working on this prioritized backlog and trying to optimize the flow and the productivity of the organization to get as much done as we possibly could. We didn't plan these in detail. If you're on the business side and you want to know what was getting done, you could quickly look at here and you could say if your requirements are here in the queue, it's probably going to happen in the next monthly release. If you're around here on the line, it may or may not happen depending on how throughput goes and productivity goes. So instead of pulling on the software team to do a detailed plan and figure out whether it'll happen or not, the business and the development teams were working together on trying to optimize flow so they could get as far through the stack as they possibly could. And if you're way up here on the stack, it may or may not happen depending on how the productivity of the organization goes. So it was, the bottom line is focusing on throughput and focusing in on a very well prioritized backlog. We did need to have other steps in place to make planning decisions on different range. When you can use less than 50% of your capacity, it's going to be pretty easy to commit 18 months out in the future. As you get tighter into the range, you can start to commit another level of your capacity with this, but eventually you're releasing work into the system based on your ability to get things done, and it's a prioritized backlog for that thing. There's probably some questions. This example, I try to have a little more detail in my book, and I'll make myself available for questions if you have that afterwards. But you know, we started with, let's make our process visible because different applications need different approaches. Then once we've done that, we shifted to building in quality and automated the repetitive tasks so that we can afford to go to smaller batch sizes to make the triage more efficient. And we've addressed things that are a bottleneck for releasing. Once we've done all those, the next fundamental shift and the next big change that you need to make in an organization is really fundamentally modifying your approaches to planning to take advantage of the unique characteristics and capabilities of software. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Jeff.
You bet. You know, and this is where Plutora comes in. We can help give you visibility into the entire process. When Gary talks about finding the bottlenecks, that's what we do. We bring all the planning and the requirements together with the actual delivery, showing you the bottlenecks wherever they may be in the process. We'll help you identify where there's too much inventory in the system and on to delivery. That's why you use a system like Plutora. And the next slide, you know, this is the art and science of managing these release trains and value streams is really why Forrester put this wave together, looking at the visualizations and integrations of the tool chain and the governance that comes along with it. And you can get that wave on our website, looking at the overall marketplace and people that help you do that. And with that, let's move on because there's a bunch of questions that we can dive into. So, oh, that's right. Go ahead, Gary.
Real quick as we go through this, you know, free ebook for the first 10 people that go to my website and click on it and enter plan as the code. If you'd like a copy of my slides, send it to slides@gruver.info. And this was a new one. This is unique. I found that these webinars are somewhat one-ended, and it's hard for me to do these well, and especially for this one with planning is so different that it's really going to take more of a dialogue. And as I've gotten this content out here, I'm looking for feedback from people, and I'm also, you know, offering up as a trade-off, willing to, you know, give you 30 minutes of my time to answer whatever questions you might have and really see if I can't help you understand some of the bottlenecks, some of the trade-offs that you might be making, and as you transform and answer any questions you might have, because it's, you know, somebody can type in a question, but we don't really get the dialogue part of that. So if you wanted to go out, I think I've got some time out for the next 10 days or so. If you wanted to go out to my calendar and grab some time and just set up a meeting to chat, let's do that. And with that, what do we have for questions, Jeff?
Oh, there's a ton of stuff. So if you have questions, please get them into the question panel. The first one actually is, I come from an organization where we have a PMO office that does yearly planning, and I don't necessarily have visibility into everything they're looking at. What advice do you have for me as I look at the features that are coming and how to work with that office?
I think part of it is really helping the PMO understand how to work differently and to prioritize backlog and staffing stable product teams. What we have a lot of times is the PMO is going to staff a project, and it's going to be a capital budget for a project, and it's going to have a start date and a complete date. And that really, a couple of things, it doesn't take advantage of the fact that software is so flexible that we can continuously improve and should continuously improve the product. And so the idea of a stop and start date for a software deliverable is starting to change, and people are moving to managing product teams that continually improve the product. And when you staff these teams that are stable, they also continually improve the process. If you know you're a project team, and when you're done and you don't have to work on it ever again, then you're less likely to go in and invest in test automation, deployment automation, really making your product or your process for your product more efficient and more effective. And because of that, most organizations have shifted away from that. And it's really moving to this idea of staffing stable product teams, making sure we have a prioritized backlog. And those are the types of things that leading edge companies are doing to take advantage of the flexibility that software provides. But this is very different because most PMOs are trying to manage software just like this. Let's get a detailed Gantt chart. Let's know exactly what you're going to deliver. Let's talk about the ROI. Let's go through all of these different pieces. So it's really going to be, how do you get them to shift their thinking about this? How do you get them to modify that? And hopefully the book helps. Hopefully these webinars helps. If you want to talk about it a little bit more, grab 30 minutes with me. Maybe we can brainstorm, your unique challenges, the people you're trying to influence, and think about, maybe we can strategize about how you could be a lot better at that.
It sounds like part of that too is to help them create some kind of backlog that you can then, prioritize, and they can have an idea of when things are going to deliver. But then they'll need better insights into that delivery so they know what's going on. Go ahead.
And that's kind of what we tried to get to with these types of charts, right? You get these, what are the business decisions the PMO is trying to make in the time frame that they're trying to make them, and what is the least amount that I can invest in it? Because if you look at this requirements process, just putting an idea on the list not a lot of investments. I don't really care. But once I start doing this, I've invested energy, effort into that, and I'm either, if I change my priorities, I'm going to throw away that inventory and that effort that I put into it, so it's waste. Or if I've committed to delivering that plan, then I'm not going to want to change it even if the market changes. So, there's a lot of inefficiencies associated with investing too much in requirements, and you want to really think about, what we're trying to do is get the most value a developer can deliver, and we're trying to do that by making sure they're working on the most important things. And with the market changing as fast as it can, if we invest too much over here, we're not going to want to change what we have the developers working on because it's going to require throwing away investment. So when they're ready, start pulling work in through the system that way.
Very cool. There's a question about the planning trade-offs of features versus, the actual delivery process, whether that be product debt or process debt and so forth. How do you typically navigate that in a planning to actually, decide what are the ideal breakdown and communicating that?
Well, one more time, this was kind of
The
Sharp
trade-offs, the
versus,
question is, what advice do you have for planning trade-offs? What for planning trade-offs between features versus product delivery is the question, and I embellished it a bit.
yeah, yeah. No, it's a little, this is one of the biggest challenges. People always ask me, these are great ideas, but I'm already booked 150% of my capacity. Where I'm going to find the time? And what I've decided, and this is where I spend a lot of time with executives, because I think if they had good visibility of the waste and inefficiencies in the process, you would get them to commit to sharpening the saw. At some level, you realize that you need to, if you're going to cut more with the saw, you need to make sure that you're sharpening it on a regular basis. If you're having that level of discussion with the product owner, or maybe in the PMO, you very rarely do I see those people prioritizing the sharpening the saw, the process improvement types of stuff. You need to get that strategically up at a high enough level. And I think what you need to do to make that happen is what we talked about in the first several webinars, where we need to make the process visible, we need to make the waste visible, and then when we fix things, we need to show the impact that that change had on removing waste. And if we're really good at that process, my belief is that we can convince executives to invest in sharpening the saw. And they're going to have to do, something where they negotiate with the business or the product owner side, depending on what type of organization you're in, or marketing, to say, okay, you get the prioritized backlogs of features, but I get X% of my capacity to prioritize improving the efficiency of my organization. And
Sure.
You're going to have to get to that level of discussion.
Well, and that's something it sounds like everybody could do today. It's just before you estimate features, make sure to estimate in a percentage where you can do process improvement as part of that process.
And you need a well prioritized backlog of process improvement ideas.
Absolutely, and mix all that together. Gotcha. There's a question about estimating completion when you're using more of a Kanban method. The question, how do you estimate completion when you're using a pull method?
No, I get that, but I'm much more interested in optimizing the flow through this system. And do I really, one mentality says, I want to optimize flow to a prioritized backlog. The other mentality is, I want to measure teams on accuracy of plan. And this is really a fundamental shift to say, it's much more important to me to optimize flow of the backlog and use something like this to track how well it's going and how much I'm getting done. And that's much more valuable to me than measuring teams on accuracy of plan. And what tends to happen is, when you get so focused on accuracy of plan, you tend to invest more and more in planning. And by the way, I business side, I need you to sign off in blood on the requirements that it's never going to change. And then I need to commit to this long range plan, and I get this whole dynamic of confrontation between the two groups. And then I don't take advantage of the flexibility software provides, and I don't get the two groups working together on flow. And by making this change at HP, we got the business and the development teams working together, optimized on flow. And we just looked at, we delivered every month on a monthly cadence.
Sure.
If you want to know what was coming out next month, the stuff pretty low on here, you could count on. The stuff at the edge may or may not happen, but we were an organization focused on maximizing flow and getting efficient, and we were measuring our teams on really trying to improve and deliver as much as possible and eliminating waste and inefficiencies. And we weren't measuring the teams on accuracy to plan, because when you start measuring them and holding people accountable for accuracy of plan, you buffer it, you get details, you spend the 20% of your capacity planning instead of the 5%, and you take away 15% of extra value that you could have been delivering.
Gotcha. There's a question about, the question is, can you talk about some of the systems you use to track the planning from your experience? Where did you keep all this stuff?
Oh, this was at HP a decade ago, so it was in Quality Center, and I'm not even sure Quality Center still exists. Um, this was just a spreadsheet that people put together, and the system engineers would quickly put this together and estimate it. You could put this in an ALM type of tool, but whether it's this type of information or this type of information, understanding where the work or understanding the flow, you're eventually going to need the ability to pull data together and make your processes and your waste visible if you're going to get people aligned on fixing things.
I couldn't agree with that more. And, again, a plug for Plutora. That's what we do. We help make that visible because we give role-based dashboards up to executives, up to development management. We provide insights that, highlight those areas that are not working well. And that's the point. We'll give you the ability with Plutora to actually look at your pipeline and see, a particular feature or build, what test environment does it exist now, and where can I go see it? What's the current quality? We'll give you some of these product control charts to look at, where you can see where things going, as well as orchestrate the whole process. So let me hit another question here. What can you talk about this method versus the how do you help organizations when they're coming from the iron? Well, let me just read the question. My organization is coming from an iron triangle mentality. How can I help them transform?
Read the book.
Call in Gary.
Schedule one of these 30-minute discussions with me. Get them on the place. We did this one last because it's the hardest thing to change. But it's the next lowest hanging fruit, and it's really trying to understand where the bottleneck and where the inefficiencies are. And most organizations go in starting with the repetitive task. It moves to defect and triage fixing. So this is a journey that you really need to show that you've optimized and become more efficient in these areas. And eventually you need to work it this way. And once you start getting it in development and doing those pieces, everybody in the world expects planning to work this way. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't work for software. And the agile leaders, Jim Highsmith and Martin Fowler and company, figured that out, I don't know, 20 years plus ago, or 20 years ago, and started trying to take a different approach to software planning because it is very different. And a lot of organizations are still struggling with that concept. I'm hoping by showing here's what manufacturing did and why, here's how software is different, mm-hmm. and can be managed differently, and here's how much of your capacity you're spending planning. And if you could reduce that by X, at HP we released 15% extra capacity. So if you're a leadership team, if you're an executive team, and you're thinking about, could I hire 15% more people in my organization, make them productive, or could I change my approaches to planning and get 15% increased capacity? My hope is that they'd be willing to embrace new ways of working to free up that 15% of capacity. But I'll be honest, this is going to be one of the hardest things to change in an organization, which is really why I tend to focus on, let's start here, let's get some success, let's show some success here, let's move the bottleneck around. Once we get this up and running efficiently, then we have a new capability that we need to change our rules and our processes to take advantage of that new capability. And that's kind of where we're going with changing how we approach planning.
Very cool. There's a question here. It says, as a development manager, should I expose my product inefficiencies and technical debt to the product planning team?
I
I'm
don't.
assuming.
Right. So somehow you're either going to need to be able to find the capacity on your own to fix those things, or you're going to need to make them visible so that you can get them to give you capacity to fix it. And my belief is people will work with you and help you address those inefficiencies. People talk about technical debt all the time. Not that many people make it visible so that executives and leadership teams can understand the inefficiencies in their organization and get them committed to changing. And these are the tough types of questions at the executive level, which is why, as an executive led these and done these, I tend to run workshops at the executive levels and help them. I do execution workshops too, but some of where I can add the most power and the most benefit is really working with the leadership teams and getting them to think differently about these things.
Gotcha. Our organization does yearly planning with quarterly updates. How can this process work in that environment?
Well, I think you can make it work if you're not committing 100% of your capacity long range, or you're committing, on the annual basis. If you make the shift from projects to products, what you want to be thinking about is what level of staffing do I need to assign to these different teams for the year based on what they're doing. And then at the quarterly basis, you're going to think about how do I shift capacity across these teams. So instead of thinking about how well did I accurately plan annually and how do I update the accuracy of my plan, you think on an annual basis of how well did I do at staffing my organization and putting people where they can provide the most value to the business, and work on the prioritized business that the business would like, so the prioritized backlog. And then on the quarterly basis, you look at it and say, based on the value they're creating, the backlog that they have, the list of new ideas, do I need to shift capacity across these teams?
Very cool. There's a question, how do you decide the priority from the sheet that you showed?
This
I'm
one?
assuming he's talking about that. Yeah,
Yeah.
yes.
This at HP was by the marketing team. This is what they said added the most value, and there are a bunch of different, we had the low-end printer and the high-end printer and the mid-range printer and the scanner, and they all those different marketing leads got together and they had one person provide us a prioritized backlog. I'm assuming this would come out of your PMO, or this would come out of your business side, or where it would come out of, and this is a prioritized backlog of what they think they want delivered. And you can use lightweight estimating things to give them a feel, because if they really cared about initiative J and they had the priorities exactly right, they may want to go back with a business justification to find more resources for you to staff up those 3 teams that are your bottleneck to make sure that they could get that.
Gotcha. Very cool. Can you talk a bit more about your lightweight estimating techniques?
Yeah, this was, there were some lead developers that had, more interested in the business and that side, and we kind of pulled them out, and they would do an early look discussion with marketing, what they wanted, and they'd think about which components had hit, which teams had hit, and they'd make an early estimate, and it was, 70% accurate. It was kind of the goal we set for them, and just to give them a feel so that we could make business decisions. And they were engineers that worked in the code, knew how the different pieces working, and they could give a high level estimate of what it would take. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't accurate. We didn't measure these teams on accuracy to plan. But then when we went to do the work, what we would do is we'd have a feature kickoff meeting where the system engineer would come in with the marketing person and the team that was going to do the development. You'd review the design, you'd review what the marketing team wanted. The system engineer would go through the design. He'd say, here was my estimate for why I thought it would take this much. The team would discuss, well, what if we designed it this way differently, or what if we did it that way? They'd come up with a different plan, and then they would create a work breakdown schedule, which was really their understanding of what the work would take. And that work breakdown schedule was this type of view of the requirements. So the first was just a high level, call it an epic.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where you got down more into the story types of things that were put in place by the people who was going to do the work.
Gotcha. There's a question about planning across separate teams and any advice on that when you've got. The way I read this is that there's multiple teams involved in an initiative. Any advice on planning for those in this fashion?
So this is where teams have to work together on a feature or capability?
That's the way I'm reading it. Yes.
Okay, so in that case, what we would do here is we would form virtual teams of members across those teams to work on this prioritized backlog. So when we went from here, where we had different teams that had to work on things, the feature kickoff team would have all 30 of these people in the room where they go through the design, they go figure out how to do it, and they bring it together, and they do the prioritized work breakdown and put that as to where it came together for each of these initiatives. And that's when you got the cross-team coordination, design, implementation, how do they pull it together? And then, as they're writing code, the deployment pipelines, building it, integrating it, testing it on a regular basis, and you use that process to track that. You use the automated test passing rate to track the completion of these new things as they come together.
Gotcha. Looks like we have time for just one more question. If you have any final questions, get them in now. We're quickly running out of time. Let me just kind of pick through these. You actually talked about this. Just is there any follow-up on planning to, comparing? Well, let me read the question this way. Do you compare your actuals to budget? And I'm assuming what that means is, are you looking at what the estimates were versus what was actually delivered and the work taken, and is there value in that?
I think what you get into is are you wanting to measure your teams on their ability to deliver value, or are you wanting to measure teams on their accuracy to plan?
That's a good point.
If you're going to manage something complex coming together like this, where you don't integrate very often, and you have all these things, the traditional approach and what has been done and everything else in the business is measuring teams to accuracy of plan. With software, because it's so flexible and can come together quickly, and you've used this deployment pipeline to organize the work and deliver on a more frequent basis, wouldn't you rather people focus on flow and optimizing flow for a prioritized backlog, as opposed to spending X% of their capacity trying to get better at estimating what the work's going to take?
Right, exactly. Well, and my side of that story too is, in the traditional world where someone runs around with a project saying, how's it going? We live in a new world where we have systems that track that. Why not use something like Plutora to where you can get instant transparency and everything is happening? Stop having folks run around and go ask those questions. Just, use the systems that we already have in place for transparency and make it visible. Gary, this is awesome. Great set of content. I love the book. I think it's been fantastic. If you're looking for a system to help you implement this, give us a call here at Plutora. We can help you through that. With that, Charlene, I'll turn it back to you.
All right, awesome. Yeah, we have about a minute left, so I just want to go over a quick last minute housekeeping stuff. Just a reminder, folks, that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of it, or if you just want to watch it again, you'll be able to do so. We are going to be sending out an email after today's webinar that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And the webinar is also going to be living on the devops.com website, so you can always find it there. Just go to devops.com/webinar, look in the on-demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. Gentlemen, thank you so much for a great presentation, as always. Really appreciate
Thanks.
it. Great questions, too.
Thank
All
you.
right, guys, I hope everybody has a great weekend. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day.
Bye, everyone. Thanks, Gary.